Hello, everyone, and welcome back to part three of my interview with Daniel Miller. And we've also been fortunate enough to have his wife, AnnaMarie, join us as well. So, welcome back, Daniel and AnnaMarie.
Thank you.
Thanks for
Thanks.
joining us in hour four of this episode. Um, Episode one, we talked about your kind of lives before working for the church. Episode two was sort of 2 hours of kind of in depth what it was like to work for the church and the beginnings of sort of your faith crisis at church headquarters. But we ended with you leaving the church's employ and doubling your compensation. And now what we're going to do is we're going to try and answer some questions from the listeners. And then we'll end with having you guys talk about kind of your journeys, struggling with the church or out of the church. Is that all right?
Yep.
So one question, just right off the top, a lot of people have confirmed to me that President Monson has Alzheimer's and that he really isn't leading the church and that he's really sort of not competent. Tells, people who have been with him say that he'll tell stories two or three times with the same people, same stories within the same 15-minute period, that he's just completely out of it. Now, he can still read from a teleprompter, but that he's just not able to function as a normal person. Now, as you were working in the church, did you have a sense for whether President Monson was leading? Was there ever talk about his capacity to lead, or was that just never discussed?
Never really discussed, and I think there was a question in there where somebody asked about, who's leading the day-to-day operations and whatnot. The departments that throughout the church organization were very self-sufficient. My manager, I think, was called the publishing services partner, who reported to the managing director, who would then go to whoever his meetings that he would meet with until you got up to your general authority that ultimately presided over your branch of whatnot. And they would give general guidance, general leadership, and then there would be a little more involvement and a little more motivation from the managing director, and then down to my manager. So there was some direction, but generally speaking, everybody just kind of did their own thing. They knew what their projects were. They came to work and they did their thing, and there was no real micromanagement. There was nobody there making sure you punched the clock at a certain time and whatnot. You just kind of came to work and did your thing, and it was very casual and laid back for the most part.
So you didn't get the sense that the apostles were really involved in what you were doing or directing it?
Nope. The apostles were involved for sure, but each apostle has purview over an assignment over certain areas. And so they have evolved in the area of their purview. And I'm assuming that, they would talk about their areas and what's going on in their meetings. The general authorities, the 15 met and whatnot, but no talk of President Monson having any diminished capacity in any way. It was just, they would receive instruction from my managers would receive instruction from the general authorities that oversaw my particular area.
And do you know which apostles oversaw your area?
It changed, but I think Elder Holland was involved in it, and Elder Bednar was involved in it as well. They were somehow sharing it. There's probably three of them, actually, I think, that were kind of overseeing various
kind of multimedia stuff.
Yeah.
Holland and Bednar. Okay. So there are a lot of questions about your ability to sort of see the debates regarding the Seminary Institute manuals about what gets included and what didn't, and the inoculation question and the controversial topics like peepstones or polygamy. And it sounds like you just had no interaction with any of that. Is that right?
So I wasn't involved in any of the debates that went back and forth. I've gone back, and looked at some of the things that were written in the previous Seminary and Institute manual regarding the seer stones and what it actually said, and compared compare it with what's in the new ones. And, the 2001 S&I D&C manual is very, very elusive to a seer tone. It mentions it very briefly in 1 or 2 sentences in the lesson and in a couple of other places. But for the most part, it's made very clear in that manual that the Urim and Thummim were used, which is not, we now know that's not the case, that the Urim and Thummim were not what was really used. It was the seer stone that was used the majority or all of the time.
But you didn't have visibility into the changes that were made and why they were made. You were managing the production process, but not, you didn't have visibility into the content discussions. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, I would, so I didn't really even interact with the writers themselves, except one of them, I guess the manager was also a writer. The manager of the writers was also a writer of, himself, and he would come to our status update meetings, and just the interactions with him in terms of, correlation is saying we can't add this, but I'm going to add it anyway, and I don't care what they say, and kind of back and forth stuff like that. But in terms of the actual dialogues that went back and forth, I didn't have any visibility really into the correlation and what they said and how they said it and stuff like that.
Okay. So you don't have any opinions about how candid they were or weren't, or how good of a job they did?
Well, so again, going back to the fact that the editors did a large portion of the actual correlating. Mm-hmm. I did have interactions in that front because I knew and spoke with on a daily basis those editors that were doing it and followed up. Well, where are you at? And are you on target? Do we need to adjust the time? So on and so forth. So those people who were doing some of that fact checking, I definitely had interactions with, and it may have been them that was doing the majority of the edits, but I didn't get into any real big back and forth or was in any meetings where there was big back and forth like that. I think that they corresponded through their emails and, you got to change this and they would have a working document where they would strike stuff out and so on and so forth. And I did see some of that stuff, but looking at specifics of what was actually struck out, I lost your sound.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. I was on mute for a second. Okay. So there's a bit of a discussion about the church, and this may go back to your kind of video segments, but there's a lot of questions about what used to be called heart cell, which is the church's use of sort of music and emotion to kind of, you could say manage or inspire, or if you wanted to be more cynical, say manipulate emotions. Did you have any exposure to or understanding of sort of the heart cell brand and that approach to sort of manage emotions?
There was a little bit of exposure to some of that because as part of doing the video productions, right, you have to, the producer that would work on the project had to decide what music they wanted and the feel, and is it going to be upbeat? Is it going to be powerful, spiritual? Is it going to be jazzy, bandy, whatever the case is? And they had music libraries out there that they could go through that were purchased, rights were purchased to the music to use, or they had, there was one of the videos that I did where we actually had composers who composed music specifically for the video to give us the exact look and feel, or I guess not look and feel, but feel that we wanted for that video series. And we would send them samples. We want something very similar to this. And so we would send them the sound bite, and then they would compose music specifically targeted toward that feel that we're going for on this particular scene or this episode or whatever the case is.
But in terms of just this idea of managing emotions and sort of, again, what they call heart cell, that wasn't something that you would have been aware of or exposed to or really a part of?
Well, I mean, working with the producers and going through and seeing the process, I mean, that was obviously what you wanted to do. You wanted to elicit powerful emotional responses, and you wanted people to really feel something when they watched this. And People always say, I don't think it was intentionally deceiving, but people will always say, I really feel the spirit to music. And so they would try to get music that would, quote unquote, make people feel the spirit, particularly powerful during certain powerful scenes that they would do. So there was definitely some forethought into music in the spirit, but it wasn't in a sense of I'm trying to heart sell in a devious way, I guess.
Okay. One listener wanted to know if there was ever pressure to steer sort of business contracts towards companies that were connected to the church or general authorities or the families of general authorities. Any weird stuff going on in terms of vendors you used and contracts?
Vendors and contracts, there was generally a list of those vendors that we would have that were kind of an approved list. I never did any research into, well, who are these people actually, but there was definitely a list of people if you're looking for composers that would be out there. And it was a little bit of a pain to go outside of those people because you had to go fill out the contract paperwork and get them signed up and so on and so forth with the church, which we could do, but generally speaking, they wanted you to use the people that were already in the system and had all the paperwork filled out and been vetted and whatever the case is. But I don't know in terms of the organizations or companies that were used if there was any affiliation with general authorities or others like that.
And were you aware of anyone being banned, like people that you couldn't use because they were forbidden to be used?
Yeah, there happened to be times like that where a bad experience occurred, and then contractors would be removed from the list of approved people to be used.
But you hear about Kurt Bester couldn't be used because maybe he left the church, or maybe like an actor who was in the temple, movie, later came out as gay and they had to take him out. Like, were you exposed to any of that sort of stuff?
Mm-hmm. Yep. So while I was working there, they began production at the motion picture studio for the new Temple movies. And as most people know, for several years, one of the two movies was pulled and was not used. And the reason that I was told was because so many of those people had either left the church or were homosexual or apostate or whatever the case is, that they pulled that video from usage. So that, people who associate them today and as non-members and are seeing them in church videos would not have, a shock reaction to something like that.
Do you have a sense for how much of a movie like that would have costed to then understand what the cost of pulling that movie might have been?
Well, I think that one was used for so many years that they probably got their quote unquote money's worth out of that one. But I worked on the Bible videos section a little bit, and we paid for a few short clips for the seminary and institute side to be shot, and I mean there was hundreds of thousands just on our end on seminary and institute side for a couple of 20-second clips, and you think of all of the Bible videos that are out there now, we're talking in the tens of millions to do the production on some of those. So there's big budget.
Were you ever exposed to kind of search engine optimization? Did you hear anything about that? There was a post on Reddit about how someone who worked in the sort of the technology department was told that the essays were coming up too high in the search engine retrieval process on Google, and so they had to figure out some algorithm to make them. It was either the church's own search system or on Google. I'm not sure which, but the point was they were trying to manage that the essays could be searchable but not too easily findable. Were you involved in any? Were you aware of or involved in any discussions around search and the internet and being able to find these materials?
That type of stuff was more for the ICS department to work on. They had developers and stuff like that. So it was really kind of outside of the media production, and I didn't see any of that as I was there. I've heard the same thing, that the church does participate in killing some of that stuff. I know that one of the projects that I was involved in was the content conversion project, where we were taking all of the old CES devotionals and video and everything that was related to CES and trying to get it online in a digital format. But it seemed like they did put a cutoff date on how far back that goes. They had digital material, but they put a cutoff year, I think, on that material. And my suspicion and others, I guess, was that there was controversial stuff prior to that they don't really want out there. And so they just kind of put a blanket year that we don't even want to put that stuff online, because some of the stuff that they taught is not in line with the doctrine we teach today.
Right. Somebody writes that Idaho, California, and Colorado were part of the pilot program introducing the new teaching curriculum for Sunday school, and that they were instructed to destroy or turn in their current Sunday school manuals. Do you have any light you can shed on sort of that sort of instruction to destroy things that were piloted?
Oh, they were told to destroy the pilot material?
I think so, yeah. Oh, no. Current manuals. So maybe the older stuff. Anyway, were you ever sort of privy to any attempts to sort of get rid of stuff or destroy stuff? Or do you have any idea what that might have been about?
So, not too much. I will say that while working on the Seminary and Institute side of things, one of the things that we were actually beginning piloting and shooting videos for is a pilot that they did to take seminary and institutes out of brick and mortar buildings and do everything online through Skype. And they were using the Moodle software to do that.
Interesting. Okay.
And that was the one that they contracted with. And I know there was a lot of the seminary teachers that were kind of freaking out that were full-time employees. Like, well, does that mean my job is going to be gone if we don't have brick and mortar seminary? And, so there was pilots to do things like that. But all of the old seminary manuals, as far as I know, are still online. Like, I can go pull up the old 2001 D&C right in the Gospel Library if I search for it, or on Google or on LDS.org. So I didn't ever see any times where they were trying to deliberately destroy media, to hide something that might have been controversial. The only thing I can think of with that is if there was stuff in there, doctrine in there, or different things that contradict with what's being taught in the new manuals, that they wanted people to get rid of any of the controversial stuff that doesn't meet with what's being taught today. And the best way is just to tell them to destroy it.
Okay.
Makes sense, because they've come out with a lot of those changes, right? A lot of things that I look at in the old seminary manual don't jive with what's in the new seminary manuals. And I think if that gap gets too wide, then they would probably want them to destroy it.
Okay. Allison Udall asked, what's the role of women in decision making at church headquarters?
Both of my bosses were women, so I didn't really see any sort of discrimination there for women. The two women that I worked for were very, very professional and very well capable of doing the jobs that they did. And we had women on all gamuts, across the board, in the management, down in the trenches with everybody else. I can't speak to if there was any sort of pay differences or not. I assume probably not, because they have pay scales for each grade that you're in, what you're ranked. But yeah, it wasn't like you're going into a ward council or a PEC and the men kind of dominate it. I didn't really get the sense of that. It felt like everybody had equal say, and their input was valued. One of the things I can say, especially with that, is that there was only one time in the entire 2 years that I worked there that I ever remember any sort of a confrontation of any kind, which is not normal, right, in the day-to-day workplace, especially with that many people working in the church office building on that many projects. There was only really one sort of kind of tense moment where one of the gals there got a little bit emotional and kind of felt like her efforts were being undervalued a little bit. But outside of that, I really feel like everybody was treated fairly equally.
Okay.
Seminary and Institute, obviously, there was no women. I mean, it was all men. So there were producers that would come in to do some of the work, but in terms of the management levels and all that, nobody that I worked with on the management side of things was female. So I guess I never thought about that before, but I guess that's true. I mean, there were some secretaries that were up there that were women, but in terms of anybody sitting in any of the offices in the 8th floor for seminary and institutes, I don't think there was any women that I ever saw there.
Okay, so not a lot of women at the Seminary Institute side.
Yeah, and I think that kind of holds true, though, because seminary has been historically, we want men, the women, it's been hard for women to get jobs as seminary teachers in the past, and I think they're opening that up, but still there's some of that culture there where they really want the men there, and I don't know what the women are traditional, they want you staying at home with your children and whatnot, so.
Another question, when you used actors, were the actors paid or volunteer?
Some of both. I have two of our kids were in one of a little three of our kids were in a little movie shoot, and so they'll put out casting calls in some instances, and what they a lot of times will do is they'll blast them out over some of the networks that email wise that are specifically in the industry for that. But then they'll also blast it out to current employees and say, if you know anybody, we're looking for some older couple between the age of 60 and 75 that blah, 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 fit these criteria, or a newly married couple, or a couple who has a brand new baby. The baby can't be older than 4 months. And then we'll blast it out to all our friends. And if somebody wants to do it, then they can come and volunteer. And it's just kind of a fun thing to do. And people get their little claim to fame with that. But then there were times where we had specific things that were going to be outward facing and public facing. The Bible videos were a big one. There was huge auditions for that. And those would go out. So the motion picture studio would get the list of characters that they're looking for and kind of the general traits, and we want kind of ethnic, or we want whatever the criteria is for that particular role, and they would send it out to the acting agencies, and then they would be given the date and time, and then the actors would come in and we'd go in. So I'd go in as the project manager. I would take in the producer from the sponsor. If it was family history, for example, you'd have a couple people that would go in there, and then we'd have them read small paragraphs of part of the script, and we would record them, and then we'd take those little videos and send them over to the Seminary and Institute group or a family or whoever, and then review all of those. And those were paid jobs that we would just have whatever their pay range was or whatever the case is. And there were actually paid actors that would come in for the more professional type roles that we were looking for.
Okay. Let's see. Megan wanted to know what you think the implications are for the inoculation sort of efforts in the CES manuals. So these manuals are starting to go out, right? The ones that you worked on. What do you suspect, and what are you seeing and hearing about whether it's going to work or not work with the youth? Do you have any idea?
So my initially, and I want to say that I don't think that the people who were focusing on doing inoculation had any nefarious motives or were trying to do anything sneaky or conniving. I think that they generally were concerned, true believers, right? And wanting the youth to keep their testimonies and stay strong. And inoculation was their way of, hey, maybe we can early on start to introduce these kids to some of these topics out there, because you've heard tons of stories where a missionary goes out and the investigator pulls out, well, what about this? And slaps something down on the missionaries that these missionaries have never heard before, right? And then it's shattering their faith, and the missionary comes home, or, whatever the case is. And so what I think they were attempting to do is take away the shock value that quote unquote anti-Mormons have of slapping a true believer across the face with something that will devastate them. If they can inoculate them at an early age, they can introduce them to these principles or these troubling things and give them a little bit of information so that it's not such a damaging thing, and it can take away some of that empowerment that a ex-Mormon or anti-Mormon or whatever has in being able to shake their faith, in just one big shock like that.
Sure.
And so that was, I think, their goal.
And what do you think the result is going to be?
For me personally, I think that it will actually be effective. To me, it's a little damaging because I think what will happen is they're going to be introduced to some of these topics. And so then when later on in life, maybe they're going to stumble across the essays and they're going to remember, oh yeah, I heard about some of that in seminary. And so now to me, the inoculation on the youth level is kind of a tier 1 of taking away the shock factor. But then the chance that later on they might stumble across the essays that are out there are kind of a tier 2 inoculation. So by the time they get to the point, and when they're in seminary and they ask questions, and they're really concerned, now somebody can send them out to those essays and say, well, here's some more information on the seer stone or on the blacks in the priesthood or polygamy or whatever it is. And now they can go out and get the second dose of that inoculation, which at that point now they're going to feel like they've read everything that there is to know because the church is completely open about everything and they wouldn't lie to me. And so when somebody slaps them across the face with, well, what about this? They're going to be like, oh yeah, I already know about that. I know everything there is to know about it. There's no problem with that. And so in effect, it's almost indoctrinating them and brainwashing people more into not being critical thinkers or allowing them to be critical thinkers and look at all the evidence, because now the church is more open about it and I have all the evidence right here in front of me. Whatever you're going to tell me is most likely going to be anti-Mormon lies.
So you feel like it's going to be effective in keeping people in the church?
Yeah, to an extent, I think so. I think it's going to cause true believers to feel like I've already got enough information and I don't need you to tell me all that. It's not shocking to me. It doesn't shake my faith. So I don't have a problem with it.
And that's what I've heard, that the church has sort of written off the 20 and 30 somethings currently as being kind of lost, but they're investing their efforts in the teens and people younger so that we may have a bit of a dip in membership, but that we can save the future generations because they've kind of blown it for a lot of the current generations.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's your sense?
Yep. I totally feel that exact same way. The problem is it seems like the youth now are not as inclined to just because you're wearing a white shirt and a tie and you're an old man I'm going to believe every word you say. That they're a little more of, I'm going to check out what you're saying because it just doesn't seem right. And I think they're going to run into a problem with the youth today. They're a little more free thinking and not so submissive to an authority figure.
Yeah. Any experiences where, broadcasts were released and then, or a live broadcast was made and then it was changed and edited and re-released? It sounds like you were never involved in that sort of initiative.
There was really only, in terms of general authorities, and I was involved with some of the other Bishop Kosei and a few of those guys that weren't full general authorities of the 12 and whatnot. So I was really only involved with Elder Oaks, who did one, and Elder Holland, who did one, in terms of the CES broadcast, or the Elder Oaks did that discussion panel. And the discussion panel to me was really interesting because it wasn't like what you would normally expect a panel discussion to be, where you go in there and say have somebody kind of leading it and people asking the questions and whatnot, and people responding freely and openly. It was a lot more scripted. And it just, when you watched that particular one, I was like, man, that just seems so scripted to me and rehearsed and kind of fake, And there was definitely editing done on all that stuff to people would say things and they would go on too long or whatever the case is, and they would just get the exact one little thing. So they would have the question or the topic they knew that was coming, right? And then somebody would answer, and they would make sure and get exactly the response edited into the video that the final product. So I did see some of that. Elder Holland or whoever, I do know that when they submit in their talks for correlation approval, that they're edited and looked at and so on and so forth, and then approved. And when they give the talk, they actually come back again for correlation approval and editing, because sometimes they go off script. They'll be reading on the teleprompter, and then, President Monson might jump into a story that wasn't written on the teleprompter, and so now they've got to go write that in, and so on and so forth. But in terms of what they said, I think the correlation department at this point is pretty good at making sure that they're all staying, and they're pretty good at making sure they all stay on script, and that they're not going to say anything that's going to cause major doctrinal changes to past. They're kind of all aligned, if you will, in that. And so I never saw anything where they said something that was totally non-doctrinal, and they had to go redo it or change it.
You wrote in Reddit you were a little bit disappointed that prophets and apostles had to have their conference talks correlated. Talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, that was a shock to me. I mean, for me, when Elder Holland is doing a CES devotional for the youth and his talk has to be submitted, I was like, I don't understand that. This guy is a prophet, seer, and revelator. Why does he need somebody else to approve, the things that he's saying? And I often wondered, what if he were in one of his talks, or maybe it was a conference talk, where one of the apostles or the prophet came out and said something to the effect of, "Thus saith the Lord," or "I received this, and this is what the Lord wants me to tell you." And he submitted that in his talk. The correlation who would trump there? It's new doctrine. It's not something we believed, or it's a change to doctrine. Who would win there? And I would hope that the prophets and apostles would trump when they, not that they've in the recent past said, "Thus saith the Lord," but if they did and supposedly received a revelation that contradicted current doctrine, what would actually be the result of that with the correlation committee?
Sure.
So, but yeah, it was a little disappointing, thinking who's really running things here. So.
Sorry, that was my son.
Yeah, no problem.
So somebody asks, and you may not even know about this, that the essay on the Book of Abraham does a better job at talking about the discrepancies between the papyra and the actual text of the Book of Abraham than the Institute Manual does. Have you looked into that at all, or?
I've read the essays on the Book of Abraham. Because I had so much reading to do as it was on the current projects and the rewriting of the seminary manuals. As the project manager, I'm like, if I'm going to be a part of this and writing these, I want to at least know what they say. And so trying to keep up on the reading material of all of that stuff flowing in, it really didn't give me a lot of time to go back and read other institute manuals and whatnot. So I'm not sure what they actually say about the Book of Abraham in the institute manual, but yeah, I'd be curious to see, but I'm just not sure what the discrepancies are between the two.
Okay. There's someone who's asking about hiring people that are temple worthy versus competent. And I think you've pretty much already answered that a lot of the younger people were actually quite skilled and competent. A lot of the older people were kind of burned out and zombified, I think, as you said. Mm-hmm. So I think you kind of answered that. Let's see. What about secrecy? Were you ever discouraged from talking publicly about what you were doing at work, or was that even an issue?
Yeah, on current projects, especially things like in the family history department, the restructure of the family history library. Was it the family history or the church history? The one they just did all the big, what was it? The museum, the church history museum that they just did. They remodeled and redid that whole deal there. And obviously they don't want people talking about that type of stuff. And temple movies, when they were shot, they definitely wanted all that to be hush hush. And, in fact, when the temple movies were being shot, just to get on site at the motion picture studio, everybody that worked for the church had their regular security badge, but to be on the premises, you actually had to have a separate photo ID badge to ensure that you are somebody who is supposed to be on the motion picture studio and not just a general worker. So they definitely had a lot of secrecy around stuff like that. And I worked there at the motion picture studio, and I couldn't even get in to watch the stuff they were filming for the videos.
Okay.
So they had it locked down pretty tight on the secrecy with that. And for the most part, most everybody knew, like the temple videos when they were reshooting them, that's what they were shooting. But there was no announcement that yes, this actually is what it is. It was all speculation, and somebody had leaked something unofficially. But yeah, there was nobody coming out. It was very secret, and wanted to keep it on the hush hush.
Sacred, not secret.
Yeah, both. And the same thing with Goshen. I went down for the Bible videos, and they built that whole set down there in Goshen to shoot the Bible videos. And it's a whole, town of Jerusalem remade, and it's impressive. And when we went down there prior to the Bible videos being shot and kind of got the exclusive tour, we were told you can't post anything online, no Facebook, no social media. You can't mention anything or post any pictures of the facility online. So yeah, they had some of the things they wanted to keep under their coat for sure on that.
There are people asking about how the church has portrayed Joseph Smith's translation of the Book of Mormon in the manuals. Do you have any thoughts or, experiences related to the church's attempt to sort of manage that story?
So I actually pulled it up and read it, and they just recently, and it's interesting that they just give so little credence to downplaying really what the seer stone's involvement in the translation process was, because the essays in my opinion completely contradict what's written in the seminary manuals in terms of the amount of usage that the seer stone had. The seminary manual talks about how there's at times and it even says in there he may have used the seer stone. And well, that's not the case at all. And so there's some significant contradictions, and I think maybe that's again going to the level tier 1 inoculation of introducing the possibility to then later on saying, oh, well, here's a little more information, and gently easing them into this instead of giving them the shock factor.
But there was never that discussion that you saw about, the pictures we're choosing for the manuals are misportraying Joseph Smith's translation. You were never a part of any of that sort of discussion about whether or not to portray it visually more accurately.
So the guy that actually did the design work was just right up from me in the area that I worked in, and great guy. I don't think he had any clue that the translation process was anything other than Joseph studiously looking over the gold plates and using the Urim and Thummim. And so the other thing with that is there's the church media library that has all the approved images that you can use inside of manuals without going to the intellectual property. And if you take new photos or you use new stuff, or some of the covers for the manuals, we actually had to go and they wanted to have somebody do a painting. So we had to go out and hire a painter to come in. But for the most part, the art that they used was already pre-designated and pre-approved in the church media library, and they chose from that stuff. And I don't think that there was any thought that, from the design standpoint, that we need to include that in. And I do know that the writers of Seminary and Institute signed off on the art that was used So when he's laying it out and he's putting a picture of the Savior, Joseph Smith, or whatever it is, that they approve of all the pictures that he selects. And in some cases, he would give them multiple pictures and they would pick the one that they liked. But it was all from the already pre-approved library. And I don't think that if he saw a pre-approved picture of Joseph with his face in a hat, which there probably isn't any, formally approved for use, he probably would never have chosen that one because he wouldn't have really understood what it was. So,
but the content creators now, they would know, right? By now.
Not necessarily. No.
I mean, with all the essays coming out and everything, those who are writing the Seminary Institute manuals, surely they know the basic concerns by now.
Yeah, I think the seminary people, the producers and the instructors and all those people know definitely of the issues and the concerns and essays that are out there now. But the guy maybe who's doing the design work and layout of the manual and choosing the photos, he may have no clue of any of that stuff that's out there. So he's going to pick the traditional stuff that looks good to him and fits the story.
But the writer who knows could say, I want an image of Joseph with his face in the hat, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
But I guess they haven't done that yet.
Nope. Okay. Nope. And then the big question is at the end, when the final product is done, we would have to print off the, copies of the manual and submit copies of the final product to Correlation for approval. And whether Correlation would approve of those manuals or not is another question too. Maybe they would say, we don't want those in there.
Okay. Were you at all around when that anti-masturbation / war video came out, I think at BYU, Idaho? I mean, was that something that you were privy to at the time?
That's more recent. It wasn't that like in just the last year or so.
Yeah, maybe. Okay, that's fine. So you don't remember that coming out?
I remember that. I remember the video and all that stuff. And all the spoofs that they made off of it, but I wasn't there. I think that was after I left. That was much more recent than when I was there.
So it's clear that while you were there, the church was trying to play catch up with social media and internet. Do you feel like they're catching up? And do you feel like at some point they're going to be like world experts at this stuff? How do you see that playing out?
No, because I think they react. They do member surveys and, they poll the members and figure out what the hot topics are. And I know when the videos, the podcasts and different things that we would produce before we ever released them, we would send them out and we had an agency that worked for us that would do little screeners, and all along the way, the people watching would have these little clickers to click like, don't like, and, so it would tag all the don't likes and the exact timestamp of what they didn't like. And then they could go back and write, okay, you said you didn't like this here. And then they could answer what specifically they didn't like about that. And so there was a lot of just general polling out there to try to catch up with what people are really interested in. And there's not a lot of, we're the pioneers and we're at the forefront of this. They're just trying to adapt with what changes out there and keep up with how quickly things change.
So a lot of surveying, a lot of polling, a lot of gathering data to make the decisions.
Yeah, and if there was, people watching it on YouTube, we had all kinds of stats of if this is a 5-minute video, what's the average length, and we realized, what? People don't really generally watch any longer than 3 minutes. So we have these 5-minute podcasts. We need to find a way to cut them all down to 3 minutes, because at the 3-minute mark, everybody shuts it off. Even if it's good and they like it and they say good things about it, 3 minutes, they shut it off. So now we got to find a way, to shorten things up. But they had the stats on all that stuff and how many people were visiting what sites at what times and monitoring that data like crazy.
Man, how has Mormon Stories survived if people stop tuning in after 3 minutes?
Yeah, that's a good point.
We're in our 4th hour.
Yeah, if you guys make it 3 minutes here, it's probably, that's probably a good thing.
Someone's asking if they actually used the word inoculation. Did they actually use that word?
Yep, that was definitely the word that was used, was inoculation.
That's really interesting. Okay, someone's asking whether you feel like they were producing Orwellian propaganda, either manipulating emotion or just, misrepresenting the facts. Did you ever feel like you were creating propaganda versus, credible information?
Um, at the time, I didn't, and probably for me because I didn't work on a lot of video type things where you're producing um, the Mormon message type stuff. And even when I watched the Mormon message stuff, and I actually interacted with several of those guys on the Mormon message side of things, when you're all in it like that, I never really felt like there was, propaganda type stuff. For us, when we were doing the video stuff that we did, it was like, well, how can we make this fun? And what can we do to spice it up and really kind of hit home with the youth? But I didn't really, especially as a full true believer, didn't see or think that there was any sort of propaganda there. And looking back now, I see that that's the majority of what those feel good movies and the Mormon messages and things like that are, is propaganda to just elicit a spiritual response. And some of those ones where they're talking about the end days are coming that you've seen, and putting all the music to those. I think it was Holland going around, wasn't it Holland on that video that was going around, that they put the music to, and how it's the end of days, and the wars and disasters and all that. There was definitely, that was complete propaganda. I don't know that I would have recognized it at the time. I would have just recognized it as prophecy coming true. But looking back now, yeah, there was definite propaganda. But again, I don't know that that was the intent, was to say, I'm going to create propaganda. People were like, but I do think that when they created this stuff, they were like, what can I do to make this the most powerfully impactful spiritual, and elicit that most powerful response that I can possibly elicit. Sure. And that's what they were going for.
Got it. Okay. Well, those are most of the questions that our listeners had. So unless there's anything else you wanted to talk about, I think we can go ahead and move to sort of what's led you guys sort of away from the church.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's good.
Okay. So you left the church's employ, and let's just talk about what happened then.
So I left, and obviously was still Elders Quorum president. Loved being Elders Quorum president. Just had a really good time doing that. I used to do a monthly activity called Menrichment, where we would get all the elders together and ping pong or pizza or movie and whatever it was, and it was just our Menrichment night for the guys to go out and hang out. And just, I think I was much more social in that capacity than I was prior to moving to Utah. I was a little bit of a recluse, but loved the experience. But at the same time, I'm studying all these things, and I'm really just trying to soak up information to the point where I'm up till 3 a.m. reading stuff, and she's rolling over. I keep waking her up, or I'm mad. I hit the bed or the headboard or whatever it is, that I can't believe this. And she's like, would you just go to bed, for crying out? It's 3 a.m. What are you doing? And then I get 3 or 4 hours of sleep. And before I get up to get ready for work, I'm reading again. And I just started getting this obsession that was really unhealthy. For just me in general, and for our marriage in general, because she didn't want to talk about it, and all I wanted to talk about was all the stuff that I found, that was upsetting to me. And so I had to find other outlets. And for the first little while, I think I went into the uncensored LDS discussion Facebook group, and said, hey, I'm Elders Quorum president.
That's a rough one. That's a tough one.
Yeah, so I was brand new in there, and I didn't know, and I introduced myself and kind of gave my story, and it was immediately bombarded. There was a couple of them, and they know who they are, Mark Hansen and a few of those guys that were in there, that just bombarded me to the point where I'm trying to actually defend the church. Even though I'm upset at the church, they bombarded me so hard that I'm trying to now defend the church, right? And So it was just kind of a weird dynamic there. And then ultimately, it's just like, okay, man, I can't do this anymore. It's too hard. And I just started coming. I don't know if you want to say coming over to their line of thinking. And a lot of times they posed good questions that I just didn't have answers to, and and I just had to say I don't have an answer for that. And so realizing that there are other people out there that feel those same ways and are experiencing those same things just kind of fueled me even more to find what the truth was, I think, is the big thing. And as bitter and as angry as I got, a couple of times what happened, several times, is I fell into the trap of, okay, reading what I would now consider, looking back, as true anti-Mormon material. And so the true believer will say anti-Mormon is basically anything that contradicts with what they currently believe, about the church. And, to me, that's not anti-Mormon. It may happen to be critical of the church and it may contradict what you believe, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's anti-Mormon. It just means that you believe something that, that's your choice to believe, that's not the truth. But what I found is that there's actually, so for me, on the far left, I would say that there is true anti-Mormon material that is specifically printed and published, or whatever the case is, to spread falsities and to tear the church down in a way that is not a truthful way, right? And so for me, that's the anti-Mormon material. And I fell into some of those where I would read something and start to believe it and wouldn't check the sources, and would make me mad. And then I would come to find out later that somebody totally made that up and it wasn't true at all. And then it'd be like, dang it, I can't do that. And so I began to understand that on the far left is the true anti-Mormon lies that are being spread out there. And then just to the right of that, there's the type of material out there that is presented that's factual and logical and is true evidence and has the supporting data that is very critical of the church. And so then I kind of draw a line and I say on the opposite side of that, to the right, there's the apologetic stuff that's out there. And the apologetic stuff is the faith so looking at the troubling stuff out there, but putting it and explaining it in a more of a faith promoting way. And so that counteracts the apologetics, and the critical stuff kind of balance each other. You've got the people who are going to look at the facts and they're going to say, well, here's why it's negative. And then you've got the apologetics that look at it and say, well, here's why you can still believe. And then you've got the far right, that's the church material. And you mentioned propaganda, which to me now, in a lot of instances, is very propaganda-like and will not tell the truth and will specifically lie about things. And to me, that's no different than anti-Mormon material of somebody who is out there intentionally promoting lies to get you to believe what they want you to believe. Then that's on the far left, right? The far right is materials that the church is publishing out there that they are intentionally putting in their manuals, the Sunday school, the gospel doctrine, all those manuals that are intentional lies and meant to deceive. And I've seen it, I think all, people who've really studied it have seen that the church, as much as they say there's anti-Mormon lies out there, there's pro-church lies that the church publishes as well.
Now you're saying that, okay, so this is sort of a bit of a different take than what we've heard so far, because, so far we've heard that the church kind of does their best job. They're thoughtful, they're deliberate, they're good people. Mm-hmm. But this is a bit of a different message. You're basically saying a lot of the church content is propaganda and it's deceiving people. And I haven't heard you say that up until now. So
right. And so, and I guess the distinction with that is, while I was employed there, I personally never had any instances where I saw that somebody is intentionally publishing lies. So and it's probably because I didn't know. I mean, if I had the kind of the knowledge that I have now, maybe going back, is somebody not telling the whole truth? Is the correlation department specifically striking stuff out and not telling everything that the writer wanted to say? Or does the writer, I don't know for sure, but does the writer not know the real story, and are they spinning it, and whatever the case is? And I would have been much more critical back then. But at the time, I'm looking at the people like, they're doing their best. I'm not seeing any major issues. It seems like they're all on the up and up. But looking back and actually going in, and I think it's in the teachings of the presidents of the church, for example, under Brigham Young, where it talks about how there's going to be source material that's going to be quoted in here that won't be readily available to the normal member. And you can go read that in the current Brigham Young manual that they use in gospel doctrine classes. And it says that these materials won't be readily available, and there's no need for you to go out and purchase additional material. The material that's presented in here is sufficient for your needs for study. And to me, that's hiding something. And I think there was definite intent to hide that material from the members and not have them go out and look at, well, what are all, these source material, because those source materials are going to expose the members to all kinds of stuff that Brigham Young taught that the church doesn't want them to know about. And so looking back and now seeing, I think that in some cases there are definite deliberate attempts for them to publish lies or not the whole truth or to withhold or hide stuff. And there was definite intent with that.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. So you're not a big fan of anti-Mormon stuff or pro-church propaganda. You think both are harmful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And for me, that's why it's really hard now to go back to church. Do I go back to church and do I sit in the gospel doctrine class and do I listen to what's being taught and raise my hand and say, well, that's not actually the case, and pull up the real citation right from, the history of the church or from the Journal of Discourses, or this is what Brigham Young actually said, or Joseph actually said or did, or, whatever the case. They don't want that there. And there wouldn't be a place for me to do that. And for me to go back and sit there, I would find no joy in sitting there and listening to that, because I would feel like it's propaganda.
Right. Okay. So just talk about your journey out.
Okay. Yeah. So with my obsession over the course of about another year or so, what really kind of happened for me is, and my wife probably played a big role in that, was she mentioned how, you're dwelling on all this negative stuff and you're bitter and you're angry, and are you looking at things, on both sides of the story? And in some cases I look back at that point and I'm like, you know what? No, I'm really not. And I need to change my perspective of how I'm viewing this. And so what I decided to do in my study was I need to place myself as if I'm a juror. And I've been called to look at the evidence for, and I need to look at the evidence against, and I need to weigh both of them equally. So, somewhere along the lines there is when I started to hear about Fair Mormon and whatnot. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to go to Fair Mormon and check this place out. And they said they got a lot of answers to things. And I realized, you know what, they're telling you every controversial topic that there is right there on Fair Mormon on their little topics section. So I said, okay, I'm going to check this out. And then I realized, well, the sources that they're quoting as critical are right here on Fair Mormon, and I can go read the critical sources right off of Fair Mormon. What better way to study both sides? And so I really went through every topic on Fair Mormon, and I looked at what they had to say. I looked at what the critics had to say. While I was doing other readings, I read Grant Palmer's book, read some Denver Snuffer books, and things like that. But was kind of doing a lot of that at the same time, but really tried to take a step back and say, I'm going to look at the evidence for, and I'm going to look at the evidence against. And if it's for is convincing that the church is true beyond a reasonable doubt, I don't have to know for sure, but if it's beyond a reasonable doubt, then I can let my faith take me the rest of the way I'm going to believe. But conversely, if the evidence here says beyond a reasonable doubt it's not what it claims to be, then what? And the answer for me was, I got to make a decision. And I was kind of bored. I'm pretty sure where this is going to go, but ultimately it was, I read something that said, when an honest man discovers he's mistaken, he either ceases to be mistaken or he ceases to be honest. And I realized at that point that if I'm mistaken, as painful as it is for me to cut ties and to make that decision to leave 40 years of my life behind, that's what I have to do. And if I do it, it's got to be quick and painless. I've got to go in and I've got to do that surgery and just get it all out at once and then heal from it. And rather than letting it linger on and trying to slowly distance myself, I just have to cut ties. And if that's where it takes me, then I was determined that that's what I was going to do. A little bit detrimental because, Anna's kind of feeling like she's being strong, and the core of our future is solely dependent on the decision I make, whether we stay active or whether we don't. And so she kind of felt a little bit strung along through that, and that it was there. She didn't have much of a decision in that it was, I was going to make the decision and she had to live with it. And, that was a little bit painful for us to kind of experience that together.
So AnnaMarie, talk about your experience as your husband sort of, decided that the church wasn't what it claimed to be and has decided that he doesn't want to really be a part of it. Talk about what that's been like for you.
So it was very difficult. We have older children. Our oldest is 16. And so I'm not just taking myself into account through the process. Here, as a mother, I can't not think about how any big change like this would impact our kids, particularly our older two. They're 16 and 12. And for me, I'm the cautious one in the relationship, and he's the risk taker in the relationship. And so there have been times in our 18 years together where I feel like I've kind of had to rein in his spontaneity a little to keep the family on track, and to keep him from making kind of spontaneous big decisions that without thinking about the consequences. And so at this point, I'm just spending a lot of time kind of praying about things, trying to figure out what to do. The church has always been a big part of my life. And I'm happy in the church, and I'm trying to figure out, okay, what does God want me to do here? And the thing that just kept coming back to my mind over and over through kind of trying to navigate that was to put your family first and everything will be fine. And that's really not really it didn't really answer my question. But that's what I just kept feeling in my mind and in my heart, was that I needed to put my family first. And that had to be the biggest priority. And so I knew that the most important thing to the kids too would be that, we were still good. Everything was still good between us. So it was difficult too, because we would go to church. we were still going to church as a family, but he was not wanting to be there and would be kind of sending texts about how frustrated he was about what was going on. And I was trying to listen and trying to feel the spirit and all of this. And instead, all I can feel is like his frustration. And I think at some point I was finally like, just stay home. Like, just, if you don't want to be there, don't go. I'll go. I'll take whatever kids want to go with me, and whatever kids don't want to go can stay with you.
But that doesn't work when you're the elders quorum president.
Yeah, so he still was the elders quorum president. But I felt also at that time that I wasn't really sure as his wife where he stood, because I was seeing him live both sides of things. I was seeing him go to church and pretend, and then I was seeing him come home and be, not a different person. He was still the same person consistently, but I was seeing him, I don't know, maybe have a different belief system than he was putting on at church. And I wasn't really quite sure what the authentic him was at the time, which was a little bit uncomfortable for me at that point. So it was really difficult. And I just felt like, as much as we tried not to let it come between us, it like I said, it didn't create a problem. It didn't create fights. It didn't, put us on the path to divorce. But I felt like it did create this distance, because we'd made this union and this family with one goal. And the church was always a very central part of that. and now to have him going in this direction and me going this direction was kind of a terrifying thing for me. And also to feel like, well, what are covenants now? If he's, no longer believes in them, then what does that mean for the rest of us?
So where are you now about those things? Like where are your beliefs, if you're comfortable talking about it? And then how are you feeling about, things as they are now with between you and with your family?
So I was pregnant at that time, and I noticed the distance, and I thought to myself, okay, here's the thing. If this is the one and only true church, and this is what God wants me to be doing with my life, I'll fight tooth and nail for it till death. But if it's going to create a problem in my family, I better be 100% certain that I'm on the right side of this before I'm willing to sacrifice anything, any of my familiar relationships or parts of my marriage for something that I think is true, but I'm not absolutely certain. So I don't think he shared exactly what kind of happened. Have you talked about getting released and all that?
Not yet.
Okay, so he'll talk a little bit kind of about that, but after we got to that point, I realized at some point that if I was putting our marriage first, staying in the marriage wasn't enough if I wasn't listening to what he had to say, and that it wasn't fair to him to not at least sit down and have good conversations about this and kind of find out why he felt the way he did and why he believed what he did. And it wasn't okay for me to just shut him down completely without kind of hearing his side of things. And so kind of as time went on, I said to him, okay, listen, I'm ready to kind of listen to you, but it has to be in doses. So I'm trying to raise these children, and I'm kind of, have to keep everybody happy and keep everybody's lives functioning. And you might be able to kind of lock yourself in a room and read for 10 hours and come out angry and upset, but I can't do that. This family doesn't function if I do the same thing. So if you want to discuss it with me, then it's got to be in doses, and you have to understand when I say, hey, that's enough for today. That's all the negative emotion I can take for today, and we'll have to pick this discussion up later. And so that's kind of how the door opened a little bit more discussion between the two of us as far as where he stood. And I think over time too, I stopped being so fearful that looking at anything other than what I was supposed to see was going to destroy everything. So at that point, which was about a year ago, I feel like we started to kind of open the lines of communication on that. And, we don't agree on every point of everything. But I feel like we've found a path for our family, and we're really, really open with discussing where each other is at and kind of why we're at the places that we are. And we've been able to sit down with our kids and have a lot of conversations with them and tell them, here's the thing, your life is your life, and we don't want you to feel like there's one path that you have to take in your life. And no matter what you choose in your life, we fully support you. And our oldest son, at first, I think it was really difficult for him. And I thought it was because, all of a sudden we're not attending church as a family and all of this. But when push came to shove and we were able to actually sit down with him and talk, the only thing that he was really torn about was when I was attending and believing one thing and he's not attending and he's believing something different. He was feeling like no matter what he did, he was going to be disappointing one of his parents, and he was having to choose a side. And he is such a good kid, and he loves both of us. And it was breaking his heart that he thought he was going to be disappointing one of us. And since then, the fact that he knows that his life and his choices are his, and I mean, it hasn't been stressful for him. I feel like he's kind of found his own path and what he believes. And I'm sure it's, he's 16, it'll evolve and it'll grow and it'll change throughout his life. But there's definitely a confidence there and in him and a freedom that he feels to kind of figure it out on his own, and that there isn't a predestined path that we expect of him.
So it sounds like you guys are remaining active, at least you are with the kids for the most part?
No, none of us are attending at all anymore.
We've been once maybe in the last year.
Yeah, we did go to just to support a neighbor whose son was leaving on a mission. A friend of ours, we went to Sacrament. But other than that, we're not attending at all.
Is that hard for you or not hard or?
No. It was at first, Daniel never pressured me to not go or to kind of follow him along his path. I kind of came to that decision on my own. I don't know. I guess once I was willing to dig in and listen to him and to dig in and kind of do my own research, then I kind of came to some of the same conclusions that he did, just a lot later in the process. And so as a family, we just have
moved in a different direction.
Yeah.
But the thing is we look back and we still have love and respect for the life that we lived before and understand why people do it. We get it. We were there, and it's just not us. So we're in a different direction. So
AnnaMarie, there's a lot of couples out there where one believes and one doesn't, and a lot of the time the believing spouses just don't want to hear it, don't want to talk about it, and want to avoid it. And what would you say to someone like that if you were to make your case for taking a different approach? You could either make a case for not hiding or avoiding things, or you could talk about why you feel it was important to sort of go there. What would you say?
Like I said, for me, it's something that I lived through and through my whole entire life. And anyone who knows me would know that I would never be looking for an excuse to sin or to get out or to make my life easier, because I've been perfectly happy from day one.
In the church.
Yeah. I could probably count on in 18 years the number of times she drank a caffeinated beverage. I mean, like she was looking for reasons to sin.
Yeah, so I mean, I was very happy in it. It was something I would have fought tooth and nail to keep my family in, but I just felt my understanding of what I believe in God and what God wants for us. I didn't feel like I could sacrifice, that he would ever want me to sacrifice my family for something that I hadn't given everything I had to kind of make sure it was right. I mean, I know this is right. I know our family is right. I know that it's the most important thing to me. And if that's, I don't know, I just felt like it wasn't fair to him. This is the person I love most in the entire world. And I couldn't see taking someone who I've shared my entire life with and my best friend and saying that I'm going to throw it away without even discussing it with you. And at that point, there was no doubt in my mind that he was wrong and I was right. I was 100% convinced he was wrong and I was right. But I didn't feel like you can walk away without even having that conversation. Or even, I mean, never threatening to walk away, but I didn't feel like I could let it come between us and the relationship that we had without even having that conversation with him. And I felt like it was only fair I would want him to hear my side, and he did hear my side. I mean, there were a lot of times he came to me and he was angry, he was upset about something, he was frustrated. And I would kind of talk him down and give him maybe the other side of things and why I felt differently about the same subject, or why my experience maybe inside the church and with different aspects of the church was different, how he could grow up in the same church that I did, but have a completely different experience than I did inside of it. But it's not fair of me to go to him and expect him to hear all of that and to take my opinion into account without me giving him that same chance, and without me honestly stepping outside of myself and saying, what if you're right and I'm wrong? I mean, you're not really having a discussion. You're not really trying to make a relationship work if you're not considering the fact that maybe it's you that's wrong. So for me, when it got to the point that I said, yeah, I'm starting to sense that there's a difference in our relationship here, there was no choice other than to sit down and have really honest, open communication and be willing to consider that possibility that maybe I wasn't 100% right.
Yeah.
And knowing how much the church has meant to you in your life, how could you ever say that you're glad you made that decision to listen and to open up, given that it's led you out of the church?
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, there are times where there are aspects of it I definitely miss, but I think sometimes until you're outside of something, you also don't see it's, hindsight is 20/20, and there are things that you look back on and you see a little bit differently than before. And there are things about myself. Like I said, I've always been really happy. I grew up in a family with my parents have an amazing marriage. There's no yelling, there was no screaming, there was no fighting. We were very calm, talk it out kind of people. And that's really good. That's really healthy. But I feel like I grew up and I became this adult who didn't really even know how to process negative emotion at all. And I didn't know how to express even to my husband if I was upset about something, because I just would go along with whatever, kept the peace, whatever made everybody happy. And that's not particularly healthy. So I feel like one of the benefits for me is that I felt like it's not, I don't know how to explain this because I don't know how much of it kind of came from myself and how much of it came from just growing up in the church, but that I felt like there was an appropriate way to be, and being angry and being frustrated and all of that was not what was expected of me, was not the kind of person that I was supposed to be. And I feel like there's been a little bit of emotional freedom since that's allowed me to say when I'm upset about something, and that it's okay sometimes not to be the nice guy. And that doesn't mean it's okay for me to be mean, but that it's okay for me to say, hey, I don't agree with this. And I'm, what you're saying, I don't have to agree with you. And I can be vocal about that. And I can be upset about something that you say. And so I feel like that has been really healthy for me. Like I said, there's definitely aspects of it that I miss because it worked for me. I mean, it was really, I had a really happy life. I don't have any complaints about that. But for me, I didn't leave because it made me unhappy. I left because I came to the conclusion that it wasn't what it claimed to be. And so I had to kind of be true to that. In no way was I looking for a different life because I wasn't happy with the one that I had, or I felt stifled or anything like that, because that was not the case. I fought it tooth and nail, and he'll tell you I fought pretty hard.
Both did.
Yeah.
I remember
he just
many
started
nights.
earlier than I did, so I was later kind of coming into the process.
And I remember many nights laying in bed crying myself to sleep and pleading with God that if I'm being led astray or I'm being deceived, then just show me, tell me, give me a sign, give me a feeling, give me anything. And nothing. I never felt like what I was doing that God is punishing me, that I'm going down the wrong path. I got no answers at that point. So, when push comes to shove, and at some point you have to make a decision, right? And I think that for me, it was really starting to come to a head that I felt like I was living a double life, like what she said. And I wanted to find ways to be released as an elders quorum president. And how is that going to happen? But then I'm going to miss that life. And I know that I would have been in the bishopric and that would have been kind of fun, but no, it wouldn't, because back and forth. But at some point it was like, okay, I've got to find a way to get out. And So what happened at one time here in Elders Quorum President in the class in August of last year, because I was Elders Quorum President last year, right? So about August of last year, we were having an Elders Quorum class. And the person who was supposed to show up and do the lesson didn't show up. And so we're trying to wing a lesson. And we got on the topic of, it was kind of open discussion. We got on the topic of the temple ordinances and polygamy and a few of those things like that. And so, I started asking some questions, so the temple ceilings and whatnot was one of them. And I said, there's some things I don't understand about that and that are really curious to me. And it was, so let's take an example of if my sister is sealed in the temple and then she gets a divorce and remarries another man, they can't be sealed because she's already sealed to somebody else. And then they have children together with the new couple. Who are those children sealed to? And I've got 12 returned missionaries in the room, and they're like, oh, I don't know. Good question. It'll all work out in the end. But no, that's not the answer. It'll all work out in the end. There's got to be a way that they should be sealed because it's a salvational requirement that your family is sealed together. And you're telling me these people are going to die without their saving ordinances or their sealing ordinances to their family. And so I was a little bit confrontational there. And one of my friends kind of knew where I was at, and he's like, oh boy, what's Dan going to do here? And this could be bad. But then kind of the bigger one was in D&C 137. So we moved on and talking more about the sealing ordinances. And then I got talking and I said, you know what? I don't even really understand why sealing ordinances are needed in the first place. Because if you read in D&C 137, there's a specific 10-verse revelation that Joseph Smith had where he says he saw a vision where the heavens opened up and his brother Alvin, who had died, having never been baptized, was in the celestial kingdom and had obtained, the glory and blah, blah, blah. And I marveled at how that could possibly be that he's in the celestial kingdom having never been baptized. And so it goes on to basically say that men are judged according to the desires of their heart, their works and the desires of their hearts. And I said, well, if that's the case, what are all these temple ordinances even doing if people are still going into the celestial kingdom without having all these saving ordinances? And again, kind of awkward, dead silence in the class, and you could kind of hear crickets chirping. Nobody could answer it. Well, the stake high councilman was in the class that day, and he sent an email right after class to the stake president, who then sent an email over to the bishop and said, you need to get over to the President Miller's house right away. And so that's kind of where it all started there with I'm kind of outed myself and I've committed to go down this path at this point. And so that's what kind of the beginning of the end when the bishop showed up to my house.
And I just looked and confirmed that in D&C 137, it's got Alvin in the celestial kingdom along with Adam and Abraham. Mm-hmm. And I'd never really thought about that before. I'm sure apologists say that it was a vision about the future. Vision of the
future is what they say,
yeah. But that's not what that specifically says. And if you read in like verse 7 or so, or I don't remember what it is, that men are judged according to the desires of their heart. And that's why he's there, not because he was or wasn't baptized, but because he was a good man.
Yeah, verse 8, also all that shall die henceforth without a knowledge of it, who would have received it with all their hearts shall be heirs of that kingdom. Yeah,
which then in the class made me say, why do we do missionary work? Yeah. Wouldn't it be better to just let these people die and know that they would have received it anyway, and then we guarantee their salvation versus baptizing all these people and then risking the chance that they fall away and go to outer darkness or a lesser kingdom?
Yep. Yeah, for I, the Lord, will judge all men according to their works, according to the desire of their hearts. Okay, so talk to us about how it all ended then with your stake president.
Yes, well, so the bishop shows up and we have the conversation. He tells me, the stake president wanted him to come by, and he basically started it out by saying, you can't ask these questions in church. And that was his literal, he says, if you have questions that you want to ask, you can ask them to me. And so I clarified with him. I said, so what you're saying is you are telling me not to ask these questions in church. And he said, well, I'm just saying that if you have questions, to ask them to me. And I said, so what that really means is don't ask them in church. And he said, I'm just saying that by asking these questions in church, you are leading the elders into battle against the adversary, and they're unprepared for that battle. And I said, so in other words, you're telling me don't ask those questions? And he's like, well, yeah, in a roundabout way. And he said, you can ask any of those questions to me because I have keys that will protect me from the adversary and being led astray.
Wow.
And I'm like, well, can you quantify what those keys are? Can you point to me somewhere in the scripture that says that you have those keys? Because I don't believe that one bit. And I think, Bishop, you're naive if you think that this material that's out there isn't damning enough to the church that when you read it yourself, that you wouldn't have questions yourself. And he assured me, no, I couldn't be led astray because my keys protect me from that. And I go, oh, okay, whatever. And I think the part of it that really upset me is he says, you know what your problem is? And as soon as he said that, it just kind of set me off. And I'm like, no, why don't you tell me what my problem is? He's like, well, I didn't mean it that way, but I just mean that I think the issue here is that you are allowing the adversary to use your intellect to deceive you. And I said, yeah, I remember a conference talk where I heard somebody talk about inappropriate intellectualism, and I find that quite fascinating and quite humorous that the church warns you against inappropriate intellectualism. And like, what does that even mean? Like, didn't God give me a brain to critically think for myself and study it out? And am I not told to study it out for myself? And so I said, you know what your problem is that I could say the same thing to you, is you're allowing Satan to deceive you by not using your intellect and causing you to remain, faithful in the church. And so how can you prove which one of us is right? How can you prove that he's deceiving me versus the Spirit is leading me toward actual truth versus, you're not using your intellect, and so Satan is using you as easy prey to keep you in something that's not true. And he's like, well, yeah, I guess I could see that. And all I know is that following the prophet will bring happiness. And I said, well, which part of what the prophet says? Because there's been many a times that a current prophet has disavowed things that a previous prophet says. So if current prophets can disavow past prophets, then how do I know what a current prophet is saying isn't going to be disavowed in the future by a future prophet? And he's like, well, I can just tell you that happiness comes, and if the prophet told me to stand on my head, I would stand on my head. And I said, well, if the prophet told me to stand on my head, I would think about that and decide whether or not that had any relevance to my salvation. And if it didn't, I would discard it and say that's of no value and move on to something else. And I said, that's the difference between us. And so, we kind of went back and forth on a lot of that stuff. And he bore his testimony that the church is true, and he's prayed about it. And I said, well, I've prayed about it, and I bear my testimony that the church is not true. So which one of us is right? And I was kind of just laying it all out there at that point. And I said, you know what, Bishop, at this point, just go ahead and release me. I've been doing it for enough years, and let's give somebody else a chance. And I just need to take a step back. And he made the comment, well, you mean take a step back from your calling and not from church, right? And I said, not necessarily. I may take a break from church for a little while as well. He's like, well, we love you, and I'm not going to let you take a step back, and I whatever. And I said, well, that's not really your decision to make, but, I appreciate your concern, but I need a break for a while. And so we kind of parted ways there, and a couple days later, I got a phone call, and that was on that same Sunday, but like on a Tuesday, I think I got a call from the stake secretary or clerk or whatever saying the stake president wanted to meet with me. And I said, well, what's that about? He said, I don't know. I just scheduled the appointments. And I said, well, I asked to be released from my calling as Elders Quorum president, and I'm assuming that he wants to meet with me to talk about that. But I don't need to have a meeting with him to be released. So just go ahead and tell him to release me and that I don't need a meeting. And the clerk was like, oh, okay. And he was a little kind of shocked. And so I never heard back from him. But at the time, so the next Sunday was when the stake president wanted to meet with me at like 2 or whatever in the afternoon. Guess who knocks on my door at 2:00 at the time that I was supposed to meet when I said I didn't want to? And there's the stake president. first thing he says is, President, did I do something to offend you? And I said, no, not at all. I just didn't want to have this conversation and go deeply into, all the issues that are out there. And I'm just ready to be released. And I was hoping you could respect that. And he's like, well, do you mind if I come in and talk to you for a few minutes? And so he did. And I asked him all the same questions that I asked the bishop and asked in elders quorum and all that. And he was actually aware of the CES letter. His brother-in-law had left the church and had sent him a copy, and he said that he had read the CES letter, and he said, I have a few questions and issues with things of my own that, I'm working through, so I understand where you're at. And great conversation, but, ultimately, at the end, I asked to be released again, and I said, there's a lot of this stuff out there, and I'm not looking to lead other people out of the church. And as long as you leave me alone and give me my space, I won't go around the neighborhood and to others and share the things that I feel and try to lead people out of the church either. And let's just respect that. And so far he has. So it's that portion of it has been a very clean break.
Okay.
Maybe we can talk a little bit of, some of the struggles of coming out and the living in Utah County, with the friends and neighbors and everybody wanting to rescue your soul and all that stuff and thinking you're deceived. And so we did experience a little bit of that. Had people call me who, the Spirit just prompted me that I need to call you and we needed to talk. And oh, all right, yeah, sure, let's talk. And we would have big, long 2-hour conversations, And at the end of it, they couldn't answer any of my questions, and there was really nothing resolved. And I always looked back on those conversations like, so if the Spirit prompted you to call me, what was going to be the expected result? Should it have been, if the Spirit really prompted you to call me, shouldn't you have rescued me or saved me or impacted me in some way to, influence me down a different path? Because, you didn't answer any of my questions. And so I always kind of looked back and I was like, was that really the Spirit, or was that you kind of just thinking to yourself that I need to make the call or whatever? And so it would just seem to me like if it was really the Spirit, that there would have been a quote unquote beneficial fruit of that prompting that I just didn't see any. So several of those instances occurred. I had, some different people who would invite my children to go to church without me knowing, that kind of frustrated me a little bit, and when I was in ward council, there was kind of that initiative to, what can we do to involve their children so that their parents will come back? And so I saw a little bit of that they're trying to get back to me through my kids and all that stuff. And there were many instances that I think some of the big things that I really felt, and I feel to this day, when I'm trying to talk to a true believer and they're trying to answer questions or they're trying to save me, to me, I feel like I'm standing and I'm looking at 2 apples on a table. And I can see that there's 2 apples on that table. And the person who's trying to rescue my soul has their back to the table facing me. And they're telling me there's really 3 apples on the table. And I'm bearing my testimony that there's really more to it, and you don't see it right now, but you will. And, all these powerful feelings of there's really 3 apples. And I'm saying, just turn around and look for yourself to see there's 2 apples there. And they're saying, I don't need to because I already know there's 3. And so we're speaking on 2 different terms, right? They're speaking that they have the feeling that there's 3 apples, but they refuse to look to see whether or not there's actually 2, like what I'm telling them. And so I use that analogy, I guess, that when I can see with my own 2 eyes that there's 2 apples there, even though you're telling me there's 3 when you haven't looked, there is no need for me to pray and to read my scriptures more, because at some point the evidence outweighs the need for that faith to believe. When I can see it there, no amount of praying and reading my scriptures is ever going to change the physical sight that I can see the evidence against.
There's actually, I had an episode with a man named James Nagel who talked about social psychology. And there's a really famous study in psychology called the Ash line experiment. And in effect, in this experiment, they would have a bunch of people all in sequence say that a line was shorter than it really was, or taller than it really was. And if enough people were willing to say, give the inaccurate information, the person that they were studying would be willing to also provide, the inaccurate answer, because
even though they knew it was inaccurate.
Even though they knew it was inaccurate, and it just showed the power of peer pressure. I'm sure I didn't explain that perfectly, but if anyone wants to look up ASCH, the Ash Line Experiment, it's fascinating.
Yeah, and the other thing that started to become really fascinating to me was, and you probably are very familiar with the BITE methodology, that now looking back, I see that BITE methodology was being employed by the church.
What did that acronym mean, BITE?
So BITE is, it's what high demand groups implement as a structure for mind controlling people. And basically what it is BITE stands for behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions. And so they try to control all of those aspects of your life. And what they do is, high demand organization will control the flow of information to its members in an effort to control their behavior, their thoughts, and their emotions, right? And in Mormonism, you're taught to behave a certain way, given the commandments, and look in a certain way and represent, right, in a certain way. You're taught that you're supposed to feel a certain way. Your emotions, or certain responses, you're supposed to, have certain emotions in a certain way. And you're told that your thoughts have to be pure. You have to always have pure thoughts and avoid impure thoughts and all that stuff, right? So the church actually employs that BITE methodology by controlling
and avoid any information that would ever cause you to doubt.
Right. Yep. And so what happens is the church tells you only read through church approved sources. And so they're controlling that flow of information. And what happens is that information, now your behaviors are conditioned. Your whole life you're taught how you're supposed to behave, how you're supposed to think, and how you're supposed to feel. Well, what happens is anytime you encounter anything that takes your behavior, so let's say you're tempted to drink coffee or alcohol, or caffeine in some people's cases, right? This feeling of anxiety and angst overcomes you, and you have, and I think they call it cognitive dissonance, right? You have this anxiety that you don't like, that you need to get back to your comfort zone. And so what happens is the church tells you that's Satan tempting you. And they use Satan as the ploy. Well, it's scientifically proven that it's not Satan, it's cognitive dissonance, and it's a chemical reaction that happens to conditioning over long periods of time to people. And the same thing about your thoughts. When you start to have impure thoughts, you get this bad feeling, and I got to get back in line, and I got to repent, and so on and so forth. And the church uses that as Satan. And then conversely, when you confirm your behavior by doing the right thing, you feel good about it. And that's the confirmation bias that comes into place. Well, the church uses it. That's the spirit that's doing that, right? And so very, very powerful. Look up the BITE methodology and how that works. Looking back now, I see that the church employs that. And part of keeping people in that BITE model is the whole bubble that we talked about earlier, where at an early age, you're baptized. And then you've got to get the priesthood, so you have to be worthy, right? And all the different priesthoods along the way, you have to be worthy. And then you have to be worthy to go on a mission. And then you come home and you have to be worthy to be married in the temple. And then what do they tell you? Have kids right away and multiply and replenish. So you have kids, and now you've got to do baby blessings right away, and more baptisms and more baby blessings, and now priesthood confirmations. And so the church has this structure set up for especially males to keep you in that bubble, using that BITE methodology of worthiness and never having your behaviors, thoughts, or emotions out of alignment. And it's very powerful because you've always got to be worthy for the next thing that's going to happen. And I think it's, for me personally, looking back now, I think it's very thought out in how they do that, keeping you in the bubble of making sure that there's something that you always have to prepare for along the way. And I've really looked back and I see that that's pretty powerful, and it's very indoctrinating and brainwashing, and I get why people are in it, and it's so hard to escape from it now.
And having worked in the curriculum department, you sort of got to see firsthand how they do that.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. So let's talk about just to wrap up, maybe just tell us really quickly where you are now. AnnaMarie's already told us that you guys don't go to church. So to talk really briefly about where your beliefs are now.
I think I've wavered all over the place. For me, the big thing right now is, and I guess more appealing or most appealing to me, is that our souls or our consciousness exists and maybe has always existed. And I don't look at life anymore as we come down here and there's sin and righteousness. I look at it more like we, prior to this life as a consciousness or as a soul, looked at what we need to personally grow and expand our consciousness. And we chose a general area that would help us grow in the area of where we wanted to excel or improve or expand our consciousness or whatever the case is. And so as we come down here and we make mistakes, that's part of why we came here, is to learn all of these things. And so for me, I don't really necessarily believe that there's sin that's going to separate you, that's going to keep you out of heaven. I believe that we're going to come here and we're going to learn the lessons that we need to learn through the good experiences and the bad experiences, and we're going to take that with us on the journey into the next life, for whatever that brings. And who knows, maybe we'll decide we're content for a while as this conscious being of some sort, and maybe at some point in the future we're going to say, you know what, now I want to go learn these things. And I need to expand my consciousness, or want to here, and I'm going to go live this type of a life. And, maybe you're going to live multiple lives and try to expand your consciousness in multiple ways. And the big thing is really, to me, learning to love other people unconditionally, which is a hard thing to do, but it's about, even in Mormonism, as much as I don't agree with the doctrine and the things that are being taught there now, that if that's something that you need and that's the anchor in your life that's going to help you to be a good person and it brings you happiness, then I'm happy for you. And like the Article of Faith says, that you believe that all men can worship to the God Almighty to the dictates of their own conscience. All I ask is that you respect that of me and understand that I didn't make this decision to leave and go down the path and the journey that I'm on now because I wanted to sin, or I was lazy, or I was deceived, but because I studied it out and I critically thought about it and made the decision that I'm following the evidence. And Mormonism is no longer tied to my sense of identity. Like when I was a Mormon and somebody would attack Mormonism, because I'm this cookie cutter Mormon and Mormonism is who I am, and I know you've probably felt this, your life. Mormonism is who I am. I'm a Mormon. That's my culture. Mormonism is your sense of identity. And so when somebody attacks your belief system, they're attacking you. And to be able to finally get away from that and have a belief system based on facts and evidence and logic, if somebody can come to me and present evidence to me that contradicts what I now currently believe, I'm not offended by it anymore. I'm actually happy. If you can prove to me, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence. And if you can show me the evidence that what I believe now is not right, then I'm happy, because that means I can discard the untruth and I can move that much closer to what actual truth is. And at the end of the day, I feel like Mormonism for me was just such a minefield that you had to navigate, that I can't believe in a God, place all these tricks and, DNA and all the stuff that's out there for me to have to muddle through to believe. That I think it's much simpler than that. And so that's the path, that I've kind of gone down, is just really learning to kind of expand my consciousness and take every moment and every experience as a opportunity to learn to love myself and family and friends and other people. And it's all about love at this point. And I definitely still have my moments where I'm bitter and I'm angry and I fall back into it and I have to bring myself back in check, or I'll put a post on Facebook that, is not about love, that's about, I don't like this or that, and I have to, always course correct and self-correct, but I'm definitely much more self-aware than I've ever been in my life.
So AnnaMarie, a lot of people who come to the conclusion that the church isn't what it claims to be feel scared to leave. And I think most of the time, honestly, they're just worried, can I be happy and healthy and moral as an individual? Can I have a happy and healthy marriage outside the church? And can I raise happy and healthy kids? Can you talk about whether you think those things are possible leaving the church, and whether, you know, you've been able to be individually healthy and happy and moral, to have a healthy and happy marriage, and to raise healthy and happy kids outside of the church?
Yeah, absolutely. I had every one of those concerns. I didn't really know how to figure out what I wanted without doing what I always was told I was supposed to want. And so I was very kind of scared about what exactly that was going to mean, you know, if I made that choice. Okay, now that nobody is telling me every second of every day, or, you know, every week, what exactly it is that's going to bring me happiness, and I have to figure that out on my own. That was kind of scary for me. But I knew that the biggest thing that had always brought me joy in my life was my husband and my children. And so he and I had kind of a lot of discussions about, all right, what do we want for our family? And really distracting. Sorry.
Please.
What do we really want for our family? And we realized that, you know, most of who we are that we thought was tied up in Mormonism really wasn't. Really, it was who we were. It wasn't, you know, I'm loving because I'm loving. I'm not loving because the Mormon Church told me that I need to be loving. I'm moral because I'm moral, not because, you know, the Mormon Church told me that I have to be more moral. But I didn't necessarily know that beforehand, I guess. So,
and we've talked before that if you need the threat of eternal damnation and torture to be a good person, then you're not a good person. You know,
right.
And that's what we teach our kids.
So for us, you know, there's a lot that didn't change in our lives. We still spend a lot of time together as a family. We still focus on service. We still, you know, are charitable. And I feel like our focus really has not changed in that way whatsoever. I do feel a little bit of freedom in that I want my kids to know that this is their life, that they are in charge of it, that I didn't feel that guilt and that pressure and that it has to be this way as much as he did. But I don't want them to feel that. And, you know, we talk with them a lot about that, about how they get to make their own choices. And the thing is, our morals really didn't change. I really can't think of anything that changed much other than, you know, yes, we don't go to church on Sundays, and there's a couple, you know, maybe doctrinal things or whatever that our beliefs are different. But as far as
10% raise.
Yeah, our actual, you know, morals have not changed at all. Our family has not changed at all. And I feel like our relationship itself has grown. I don't know how to describe it. I guess, how do I put this without kind of making one of the two of us look bad? I feel like there was a lot of time where I felt like there was this ideal of how everything had to be. And because, like I said, I'm the cautious one in the relationship and he's the more spontaneous one in the relationship, I think sometimes it maybe drove a little bit of a wedge between us, that I felt this burden on me to kind of rein him back into this worthy priesthood holder that he was supposed to be. And
Which would then make me feel that guilt I talked about before.
Yeah. And so, I mean, while the relationship was working at that time, he definitely felt like he wasn't free to fully be himself. And I felt like if I wasn't on my toes all of the time, watching to make sure he was making sound decisions, which he's a responsible adult, for heaven's sakes. He's always been a responsible adult. But there was just this ideal of this perfect priesthood holder that we both thought that he had to be. And I felt a lot of the pressure to kind of rein him in to be that person. And I feel like once that kind of went out the window, he didn't change into this person that suddenly went off the deep end. He's still exactly the same as he was before. But now there's not this pressure, and there's not this like anxiety feeling on him that he has to try to mold himself into someone that he's not. And there's a big relief off of me when I realize that the person that he is, when I'm not putting that pressure on him, when that pressure isn't on him, is already who he's supposed to be, is already who I want him to be. It doesn't, I don't know. I guess there was always that fear inside of me that isn't there anymore. I've gotten to know who he really is, and that it's already who he needs to be.
And for me to have that kind of cathartic relief of no longer needing to hang on to the guilt of never being worthy or good enough has brought me more happiness into my life than I ever experienced while I was in Mormonism, because I don't have to go and daily repent. I can just be me, and I can be with who I am, and I'm content with that.
But even by
and he works hard. What's that?
Even by church standards, you would still say you're a moral and ethical person?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
You just don't have the guilt and the shame associated with it.
You know, and even with as much removed as he wants to be from the church, still show up to a lot of the, the moves and the service projects. He's the first one there because he was
sometimes the only one
there because he's not there because it was his calling. He was there because he wanted to help, and he wanted to be there for people. He wanted to, to be a friend, to be a neighbor. And so he still goes to all of those because it's who he is, not because it was his calling.
Got it. Well, that's great. Well, I see that he stood up.
He'll be right back. Yeah.
Oh no, it's okay. So the way I think for me, it's been fascinating to hear about Daniel's experiences working at church headquarters. So I really appreciate, Daniel, that you've been willing to share with us your experiences at church headquarters. For me, the golden nugget of this whole thing, honestly, is to hear how you guys have handled your faith transition as a couple. So that's a real gem for me, and I almost want to have you guys back for Mormon Transitions podcast just to talk about that more and to hear more from AnnaMarie. But I just want to thank you guys for coming on, Daniel for telling your story, AnnaMarie for supporting him. You have a great, thoughtful perspective as well, and you guys just really represent this path well. So it's time to wrap up, and I just want to thank you guys for coming on and sharing your stories. AnnaMarie, do you have any final thoughts or perspective you want to add, or a final testimony before we close?
I would just like to say, I know, especially for my perspective as a woman, that I know there are probably a lot of moms out there that have questions about, because I've heard it, about their children and how to kind of take this path with their kids and keep it kind of from being a traumatic experience for them. And if anybody has any questions on that, would like to reach out, then that's a conversation we can definitely have. I feel like we've been able to kind of help our kids through this process in a pretty smooth kind of transition without them going through any sort of trauma. And we have kids all the way from 1 to 16, so all the way through.
AnnaMarie Emfield Miller is the Facebook name.
Yeah.
And I will say, in regards to the kids, we definitely, and I reiterate, especially with my oldest, you got one life. And as much as we talk about religion and what we do and don't believe, none of us really knows, right? This, as far as we know, this could be it. And the day that you die, you fade to black. And that's it. You're done. We can all speculate and say we've got these feelings, but when it comes down to it, nobody knows. So when my son asks, Dad, what do you think about this or that? I always reiterate to him, this is your one shot. You do what's going to make you happy, and I will support you in anything that you decide to do to give you happiness, as long as you're trying to, love yourself and love other people and build yourself and other people up. And he came to me a couple months ago and he said, Dad, I just really want to tell you that I appreciate you helping me kind of get out of the religious mindset and free myself and not have to go through the stuff that you're going through at age 40, and that you allow me to think for myself, and I really appreciate that my life is now mine to do whatever I want. And having your 16-year-old son come and say that when you're so worried about what this faith transition is going to do has been more reaffirming than anything, because I've seen him blossom and just say, the world is mine, I can do it, and I'll have the support. And instead of being pressured into mission and marriage and all these things, he can do what he wants now. And there is no path, there is no pattern. Your life is your own. You got one shot at it. Go do what you want to do.
Beautiful. All right. Well, Daniel Miller, thank you so much for being willing to open up and share your story. It's been really interesting. I think it's going to be an important piece of history for those who just want to learn a little bit more about what goes on inside. We don't have much of that on record in the world. So this is one of the first times I think a church employee has ever spoken publicly about what it's like.
Cool.
So thank you for that, and your journey as well. And AnnaMarie, you've just been delightful, and thank you so much for joining and supporting Daniel. And I hope to have you guys back.
Thank you.
For maybe a Mormon Transitions episode, if that's all right.
That would be awesome. We'd like that.
All right, guys, thanks so much. And listeners, please feel free to join us at mormonstories.org if you want to ask questions or make comments about this episode. I hope that maybe Daniel and AnnaMarie will be willing to maybe respond to some comments or questions if there are further ones there.
Yep.
Again, thanks to everyone who listens. And most importantly, thanks to everyone who financially supports Mormon Stories, because it pays me in a way that makes me able to do this sort of for my living. And so thanks to everyone who does that. Please continue your support. And for everyone, we'll see you again soon on Mormon Stories. Thanks again, Daniel and AnnaMarie.
All right. Thank you.
Talk to you guys soon.
Okay.